the first half of the story is all about Peter. If you said, who are the apostles in the Acts of the Apostles, and it's not the 12. They pretty much disappear fast after the first chapter or two. It's Peter and Paul. And this tells me this is also part of the great pro-Roman site, because Rome has Romulus et Remus, R and R, as it were, the hero twins of pagan Rome. Along come Petrus et Paulus. So today, when you're standing in front of St. Peter's Basilica, Peter, Paul, on your left is Peter as you face it, on your right, because they're the new hero twins. So starting even at the time of Luke, you're starting a pattern that we can't have Peter and Paul fighting with one another. We know Paul called Peter a hypocrite at Antioch, and the Epistle of Peter sort of warns against Paul. So we have to get these two guys hugging one another. And there are lots of images from the 4th century after Constantine of Peter and Paul hugging. There ain't anyone else hugging, but they're hugging one another because this is part of the propaganda, if you will, or apologetics, to say, no, these guys are fine. They are Peter and Paul, always in that order. Nobody says Paul and Peter, by the way.
Wow.
There's a feast day of Peter and Paul in the Roman Catholic tradition. There ain't no feast day of Paul and Peter.
Because Peter came first.
So yes. So you have to look at Luke and remember the first story. In fact, it's actually Peter who is the apostle of the Gentiles.
Yep.
He is the one that finally gets the revelation.
He's Petros. He's the rock.
He's the rock. Right. So granted that. Now let me turn to where we were. Let me start with names. Saul. And this is one I'm not going to die for arguing, but I'm not convinced of Saul at all. Here's why. The first argument is Paul himself says, proud to be a Jew, by the way. He's very proud of being a Jew. He keeps saying that in Romans especially. But he says, I am of the tribe of Benjamin. Now, it could be, of course, this is a negative argument. He doesn't say, my name is Saul. But the greatest, most famous person in that little mini tribe, it's not a very famous tribe, is Saul. So like, if I could use myself as a fun example, if I tell you I'm from Ireland, I'm quite likely to say I was born in Tipperary, because most people know Tipperary. They know the song Long Way from Tipperary. If I was born in Fermanagh, I wouldn't say that, because nobody knows what outside Ireland, where's Fermanagh or some other county. So I can't imagine, it's not a huge argument. It's just a delicate argument. I can't imagine Paul saying, when he's saying his credentials, as it were, I am of the tribe of Benjamin, without saying, my name is Saul. My name was Saul, or is Saul. I think what happens is part of Luke's whole transition from Jewish Judaism to Messianic Judaism, or which a lot of Jews might say non-Judaism, is that moment of transition, which happens on Cyprus, as you know, when Saul, having met the proconsul, the governor of Cyprus, whose name is Paulus, right in one verse, at that moment, Luke says his name used to be Saul, all was that beforehand, it's now is Paul, all of that afterwards. If I was reading that with a Roman eyes, I would say, okay, I'm dealing with a Jew who's just met a Roman governor called Paulus, and he's changed his name. He's adopted his name. He's obviously not a freed slave, but this must becoming his patron, his sponsor, and out of respect, sort of quasi-adopted, as it were, he's taken his name.
Sure, that makes
sense. That's the only way I could understand it. So what makes me suspicious is not so much the transition from Saul to Paul, but the very moment when Luke does it. So I am absolutely suspicious of that. His intentions are not honorable. He's showing Paul as kind of no longer real Jewish. He's sort of Messianic Jewish, but kind of is not real Jewish.
Has anyone ever asked you about the comparison between Saul of the Old Testament and how he chases David around, isn't like David, but sort of then repents after? And then we have Saul or Paul in the New Testament, chasing Christians around and then changing his mind. Has anyone ever brought that up? Maybe there's a literary thing happening there, or no?
No, I have to redo. I kind of trying to remember whether Saul really repented, to be honest with you. He probably did. I can't remember.
I'm pretty sure he did, but yeah.
But I think the main thing, because Paul himself also always begins, as Luke does, by insisting I was a persecutor. Yeah. Because that's for Paul the great proof of what he calls grace. I mean, that's why that's so important for Paul in Galatians, for example. He says, I was a persecutor and then God called me. So you're supposed to say, oh, wow. So God's this weirdo God that doesn't choose nice people and good people because of how good they are. He's chosen a persecutor. He's not just chosen a Jew or a Jew who's minding his own business. He's chosen a guy who persecuted my people, as it were, and I'm going to call him. So for Paul, this is the great proof, the living proof. And as he could say to his Gentiles, see, God will do the same for you. Don't worry. So it's important for Paul that he was a persecutor. But now, if you're reading Luke, by the way, he starts Paul persecuting in Jerusalem. He even has him, as you know, holding the coats at Stephen's lynching, which is, I think, Luke's way of having it both ways. Well, he wasn't really in on it, but I want us to associate him with it. Because for Luke, Acts, Paul begins in Jerusalem. Yeah. He doesn't begin in Damascus. He begins in Jerusalem before he ever goes to Damascus. So I want us to be deadly careful in the history of anti-Semitism about how we read Luke, Acts on Jewish Jews. Gentile Jews are ones who have become God worshippers. That's fine. That's fine.
Just for clarification, I was able to find what they were talking with this. So Saul says, "I've sinned. Return my son David, for I will not harm you anymore. I have played the fool and committed serious error." Now, some people point out that it's kind of interesting that you have a Saul in the Old Testament who's chasing around David, who is, the line of David is Jesus, and then you have. So, do you think this? I mean, it could be a coincidence, but do you think there's also sort of a literary thing happening there? What do you think about that?
Oh, it's quite possible. I mean, that's one of those things that scholars argue about, and because it can't be proved one way or the other. But sure, I would accept that.
Yeah.
Luke knows he knows the Greek Old Testament. He knows it very well. He's been to the synagogue, as I said. That's where he knows it. The more important thing for me, actually, going with Paul now, when Paul describes that moment of conversion, he doesn't simply say, I was a persecutor and I converted, let's use that word. I converted myself to mind my own business, to stop being a persecutor, to being a quiet, God-fearing Jew, to be the apostle of the Gentiles.
Right.
He does a kind of 180-degree turn.
Right.
It's from, if you want the worst to the best. He could have simply converted to be a Messianic Jew, minding his own business. So for him, it's that huge conversion that for him makes him a living. It's not just that he repented.
Right.
And if we were filming Paul, no producer in the world is going to let us away with this. That's why you have to understand Luke Acts. And I'm asking people, if you're serious, please read the second part, at least, of this book. Because the story of Luke Acts is how the Holy Spirit, because that's the protagonist. When he was conceiving the book, Luke has a problem. My first volume is going to be Jesus. That's great. That's my hero. That's everyone knows. But at the end of the first volume, he's gone. Who's running my second volume? Well, if I say Peter and Paul, that makes them equal to Jesus. And if I say Paul, then I certainly can't end with his execution, because that makes, Jesus, Paul, the two heroes of Christianity. So his protagonist is the Holy Spirit. You can see that if you read him. The Holy Spirit did this, the Holy Spirit did that. The Holy Spirit wouldn't let us go down here. It sent us across to Europe. The Holy Spirit is running the show. If it had a title, I would call it The Way of the Holy Spirit. And I'm punning on the word way, as Luke does, way meaning travels and way meaning how you live your life. So it's the way of the Holy Spirit.
Oh, Dunn.
And the whole story is in volume 1. The Holy Spirit travels with Jesus from Galilee to Jerusalem. Second volume, from Jerusalem to Rome. We end in Rome because that's where we're going, to the center of the world. It's how the Holy Spirit, let me parse Luke Acts, how the Holy Spirit changed headquarters from Jerusalem to Rome.